So why and when should you build multiple layers of seasoning on your carbon steel cookware before the first use? Hi, I'm Jed. This is Cook Culture. So as many people know, I sell carbon steel cookware and I deal with people that are transitioning from traditional nonstick, like Teflon-based nonstick, into carbon steel cookware. And so my suggestion of doing many different seasonings on a piece of carbon steel before its first use comes from trying to help people be the most successful over the longest period of time with their seasoning. So 5 layers of seasoning is kind of the most amount of seasoning that I suggest to put onto a pan before you start using it. Can you do just one seasoning and start cooking? Absolutely. That works totally fine. But a lot of people, and a growing amount of people, are trying to cook with less fat. And they will have used nonstick and said, hey, I want to keep using nonstick because I don't have to cook with much fat. This is where the problem lies. So when I have customers that are using less fat or trying to use less fat, but are fine with using some fat because you just have to with carbon steel or cast iron, but wanting to use less fat and are also at the same time cooking more fibrous style foods, whatever that happens to be, either they're reducing greens or you're cooking mushrooms and onions down or you're doing chickpeas or whatever it is that you're cooking, something that's like fibrous vegetables, and also then using liquids and not oils or fats as much in that cooking, the seasoning can take a lot of abuse. And if you have done one seasoning, or even sometimes just 2 seasonings, and then start cooking in a way that is less fat and more fiber, it can be very hard on the seasoning, and things start to degrade quite quickly. And so I highly suggest to the people that are cooking in that way that to do as much as 5 layers of seasoning, and then make sure that you post-season using some sort of an oil or fat after cooking every time. But where I'm getting to here is this depends on how you cook, right? So if you season your pan the first time and it seasons just great on the stovetop or in the oven, and you want to just get cooking, you're going to need to use quite a bit of fat and cooking fatty foods with quite a bit of fat in it. And if you cook fatty foods all the time, then you can just start cooking and you'll probably be just totally fine. Also, making sure that you're cooking at the right temperature that I've talked about in different videos, but being less concerned about the damage to your seasoning and the stripping and the drying of your seasoning. But, to be very clear, a more health conscious way of cooking less fatty foods with less fat, not that fat is a demon in any which way, that's not what I'm saying, but an excess of almost anything it can be a problem, being sugar or fat or carbohydrates or whichever. So there is that tipping point there where a lot of people are like, hey, I'm trying to find that right balance. And that's where I've run into the majority of problems, is where people are, hey, I'm really struggling. My nonstick seasoning isn't working as well. I'm finding I'm getting sticking. I'm cooking a bunch of foods and then I go cook eggs and I'm getting sticking. And once I dig into it, I'm finding that, yes, they're trying to reduce the amount of fat they have, or I'm using olive oil and just a little bit of it instead of using the grapeseed oil because grapeseed oil, in some people's opinion, has problems. And where olive oil, I've talked about it in other videos also, can be a little bit of a problem. And so if you're using just a little bit of it and quite a bit of heat, you can get a lot of gumminess and stickiness, and that can be a problem. But if you have built a really strong base with a seed oil or a thinned type oil, olive oil can work if it's really thinned, you can then get away with using different types of fats later on as long as you clean your pan properly. But I'm starting to get really nuanced because it does get very strangely nuanced when I'm dealing with customers. Not every customer is having exactly the same problem. So what I'm trying to get at here is if you cook with less fat or are looking to cook with less fat, less saturated fat specifically, and you're cooking more fibrous foods, I highly suggest to start your lifetime of using your carbon steel by cooking the seasoning up to 5 times. And I'll put a link to a video that I have below. And that can really help you go in the right direction. And I've found probably 100% of the time, because I never hear from people again, they can be struggling and struggling and struggling. And then we're like, hey, let's start at the beginning here. And I've come to realize they're trying to cook in a healthy-minded way that multiple seasonings to start with, get them on the right path, and then I don't hear from those people again. So I would say that we have success. You know, I'm not knowing for sure. Maybe they're struggling and they're just like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. But I think they're probably going in the right direction. So that's the basis of it. Seasonings from 1 to up to 5. Choice is yours. How are you cooking? Are you cooking, you know, a lot of fatty foods? Then 1 could be just fine. If you're cooking less and less fat, more and more fiber, you know, look at pre-seasoning your pan with up to 5 layers. Again, that video to that is in the show notes. And highly suggested if you are cooking a lot of drier style of foods and your pan is quite dull when you're done cooking, post-season. And just quickly, that is cleaning your pan, preheating, getting some of the fat on it, cooking it onto the stove top, or you can do it in the oven also, under a medium-low heat for 10 to 15 minutes if you want. It doesn't really matter, it can be as little as 5, just a point until it starts to dullen a little bit again. And then leave that pan and let it fully cool. And that's post-seasoning. You do that each and every time after you cook, and your seasoning will stay strong. If you're cooking a lot of saturated fat and fatty foods all the time, post-seasoning may or may not be important. Really just look at see how your pan is. If it's always shiny, it's always got a kind of a layer of cooked on fat on it, you're golden, you're good to go. So I hope that helps. Any comments, any questions, please throw them below. Thanks so much.